Hello, 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 and good evening. Welcome to day 26. Uh, let's jump straight in, shall we? So, today we are looking at. So, let me just bring up my Bible. I should do this before I start streaming. This is bad form, bad form. So, today's reading was Genesis 41 and 42. We're close in on the end of Genesis, but we rejoin Joseph. Um, so Joseph he's been thrown in prison. It's been 2 years, and this struck me as interesting. Right, it's been 2 years since the uh, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker were were taken back. Cupbearer restored, baker killed. 2 full years, and Joseph has been in prison this whole time for a crime that he didn't commit. Um, I think we read this, and sometimes it's easy to gloss over the fact that he it must have been a miserable life. Now I mentioned that I wanted to share like how I use AI sometimes, and so I was curious as to what prison life was like in the time of Joseph, and so I asked AI, as a historian, what was prison like at the time. And it provided, prison in 19th to 18th century BC, which is around the time that historians place Joseph or when he would have lived. Um, Prison was slightly different, both in some ways that are good and some ways that are bad. When we think of prison today, we think of, like cells and bars and prison as we know it modernly. But actually, it would seem prison back then was slightly different. Um, the prison that Joseph would have been thrown in wouldn't have been like a bars or dungeon. It would have really have been a normally it's like just a fortified area of the same compound. So where he was in Potiphar's house, um, it might have actually been part of Potiphar's Potiphar's compound, his house, or his where he lived. Especially as normally, where in Genesis 39 we see Potiphar threw him in the prison where the king's prisoners were kept, and that often is run by the chief of the guard, which is actually Potiphar's title. Potiphar was the chief of the guard, and so actually attached to maybe his house or a part of his compound, sometimes attached to a palace or a military compound, you'd have these fortified areas where prisoners are. Those prisoners and the king's prisoners would normally not necessarily be just criminals. It could be the cupbearer, the baker were thrown in the same prison. So it would be people that maybe have offended the throne. It could have been people that have fallen out of favor, people that owe a debt. Um, it wasn't it wasn't just a place of the worst criminals in the world. So that's kind of cool. But what it also meant was, these areas, because they were um, fortified attachments, normally it would like be stone or mud brick cells, with minimal light and ventilation. Shackles and sort of neck collars would be common amongst the prisoners. Food would be basic, but sufficient to keep the prisoners alive. Um, there was often normally a hierarchy, and so prisoners were always expected to work apparently, and so it's not like they had time to chill or whatever. They would be in full-time employment, and that could be working up the ranks. And so Joseph, as we read, came to be in charge of everything, overseeing all the other prisoners, and that would have been normal. It would have meant he was still just working. Um, The other thing is where, nowadays you do, 2 to 4 for something, you go 20 to life or something. There's a definite time period within which one spends in prison nowadays. Back then, it was common that once you're thrown in prison, you could be forgotten. Like you could just live the rest of your life there, and be left to it effectively, either until someone intervened or um, you were executed, or until maybe your case was then resolved if someone remembered to do so. And so Joseph being there, and you got to remember, being there for 2 full years, probably would have resigned himself to this being his fate. This is where he was going to be. And I can't help but imagine, for Joseph to be there after following God. So the reason why he was in the prison was because he refused to sleep with Potiphar's wife. In his heart, he knows the truth. Um, I can't imagine there would be days where he would have thought, with all my dreams, this is where I am. How my father and my brother's going to bow to me, or days where he must have thought this is the end. And there's also where I imagine there must have been times where he doubted. It was following God that got him there. I can't help but imagine there were times where he's like, what's the point? Why follow God? He could have just done what he wanted. But anyway, 2 years of that, 2 years of being imprisoned. Yeah, and yet, yeah, so Pastor Lai pointed out, he still showed that excellence. Alas, and the other thing is, well, we'll get there, because not only did he still show his excellence, but I imagine he remained in constant um, surrender to God. He, in excellence serving, I think he still served because he was working as though he was working for God. Um, anyway, Pharaoh has these interesting dreams. 7 cows, fat and healthy, eaten up by 7 thin cows, and 7 heads of grain, plump and beautiful, they're described, um, swallowed up by 7 more heads of grain, which were shriveled and withered and old. And Pharaoh calls the magicians to try and explain this dream to him. And finally, after 2 years, the cupbearer remembers Joseph, remembers that Hebrew boy in the prison. Um, and calls him out. Now, I imagine if Joseph might have died in that prison, and given the conditions, that wouldn't be that far fetched. Probably could die in the prison. That the cupbearer would probably have been thrown back in prison for remembering Joseph, for knowing about Joseph and not calling him out till now. But anyway, the cupbearer remembers Joseph, and they go and bring him. And after he shaved and he's changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh. And that again gives some insight into the state of affairs. The state of his quality of life in the prison wouldn't have been that great for him to need to get cleaned up before going to see the king, going to see Pharaoh. But he goes and again shows this reverence. It's not my power to tell you dreams. I'm not Joseph, the interpreter of dreams, but God can tell you what it means and set you at ease. Pharaoh tells him the dream, and he doesn't even say, okay, let me go and pray about this. And that suggests to me, so that's what I meant by he must have been living his life in total surrender, because when he hears the dream, it's immediate. He immediately gives a response. And we know this isn't a skill that he's built up. It's not like all of a sudden he's able to just say, okay, this normally falls into this category, and sort of interpret the dream mechanically. He himself says he can't interpret dreams, it's God. But for him to be able to so instantly just be right there and give a response and give the meanings of the dreams, and not only that, make suggestions as to how the meaning of these dreams can be, or these dreams can be a warning to save pretty much the entire ancient Near East, um, suggests to me that even in the 2 years, he still lived his life in surrender to God and in constant fellowship with God. Um, the thing that it reminds me of is when the disciples, so we're skipping into the New Testament here, but the disciples had an issue with a particular demon who had come and they couldn't drive him out. And Jesus comes and Jesus drives them out. And they ask Jesus, why couldn't we drive out this demon? And Jesus tells them, and these kind come only by prayer and fasting. And so, something that they should have been doing. The problem is, or not the problem, but the thing that it points out to me is that meant Jesus had already been praying and fasting, because he didn't say, these come up because I am the Son of God, and for you it's prayer and fasting. We know that he consistently would take himself away to go and pray, to go and fast, and he effectively stayed ready. That's a term we have in martial arts, where if you stay ready, you don't need to get ready. And so you have martial artists that are training consistently, you know, even when they haven't got a fight coming up or they haven't got a competition coming up, they train day in, day out. Because if you stay ready, if you're always ready, you don't need to get ready when the test comes, when the challenge comes. And I think Joseph was doing that. I think Joseph was staying ready in his life, in his excellence, in his service, in his putting God before all things, even in the 2 years of being in prison when you don't deserve to be, when you haven't committed the crime. Um, and that meant when the opportunity came, Joseph didn't falter. Joseph was ready and didn't need to get ready to face the opportunity. Mm. Mama asked a good question. How would we have reacted if the same happened to us? Even in the point where he's able to interpret and give a good suggestion, Joseph still doesn't. Actually, so in answering Mom's question, Mom asked, how would we have reacted if that happened to us? Would we now start bragging or want payment for interpreting the dream and try and take the glory for ourselves? Joseph does this. Um, Joseph gives the instruction and everything, and Joseph ends in Genesis 41, verse 38. Um, sorry, where is it? In 33. So Joseph 41:33. Therefore, Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Joseph didn't hold back the solution and say, all right, so Pharaoh, this is the meaning of your dream. I have an idea. If you let me out of prison, I'll give you that idea. He didn't, make it about himself. He literally said, this is a dream. This is the suggestion that, this dream God is giving you. You should probably do this with it. Pharaoh, find someone intelligent and wise and put him in charge of the entire land. Like, there's such humility in Joseph. And I think Mom's question is true. Like, would we have taken that opportunity to make a name for ourselves, to secure our position? It's not a far-fetched idea. I think most of us sometimes do that and would withhold maybe our gifting or our talent for, a better deal or for some sort of reward. Joseph didn't do that at all. And that further goes to show. Pharaoh takes him, puts him in charge, and Joseph, he's given this new name, Zaphanath Paneah, and he's given a wife, Asenath. Um, and this was whilst he was 30. At 30 years old, he began serving. Let me see if I can find how old he was when he was thrown in captivity. When he was sold, actually. Oh, man. So, Joseph was 17. And we read this. So in Genesis 37, verse 2, um, 37. I had glossed over that. In 37, verse 2, what does it say? This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, he tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half brothers, the sons of his father's wife, Bilhah and Zilpah. But Joseph brought a bad report. So, yeah, when Joseph came to report on him, Jacob loved Joseph, made him that beautiful robe. But so one day Jacob had a special gift. Um, hated him, or they couldn't say it. One night Joseph had a dream. So when he talked about his dreams, he was 17. Um, okay, right, okay. So he was 17 when he was sold into slavery. He's now 30. So he's been going, again, we talked about the 2 years in jail, but he's been going over just about um, 13 years. 13 years. Having been sold by his brothers, gone into the service of Potiphar. Potiphar's thrown him into jail. 13 years away from his father. Um, yes, mum, you're right. It was 17. Yeah, mum had that quick. I had to search AI because I forgot that we'd read it. He was 17 when he was betrayed, and 13 years later. And that also speaks to 17, around that time he has this dream. It takes 13 years for God to realize that dream, and as we said yesterday, sort of orchestrate it through the actions of his brothers, Potiphar's wife, the prison, the cupbearer coming, all of those things. 13 years before the dream that he had is about to, and the dream doesn't come true now, by the way, because Joseph is placed in he's made a prime minister of Egypt, but it's 7 years of good before another 7 years of bad when the famine hits. So it's at least um 20 years, because the good time will come, and it's after the good time that the famine comes, and then his brothers come back, and we'll get to that. But it's 20 years from his betrayal by his brothers to the if we say the realization of the dream of his brothers bowing to him is when the famine comes and they come to buy grain. 20 years to realize that dream. Now, sometimes I think, how impatient do we get when God has promised us something, or we have an idea of something that we want from God, and it's a month or 2 months before we receive it? This was a dream that Joseph had, and it was 20 years, 2 decades before it was realized. Like, I'm getting a bit excited because I didn't realize, never put those two together, that after 20 years the dream was realized. Like, we should be a lot more patient with God and sort of trusting his timing. And that 20 years was 20 years of, at least 13 years of Joseph living a pretty miserable life. Um, and then it's within the 7 years of plenty. So let's carry on there. So 13 years of pretty miserable, right? Sold by your brothers, sold to Potiphar, thrown into jail. You know, this entire time you've been ripped away from your father, ripped away from your main brother, your full brother Benjamin. You've already lost your mom, and you're living in this foreign land with people who don't know you, who don't care. Um, 13 years of that, and then 30 years old, Pharaoh makes him prime minister, and he starts to go about, gathering grain. So as they have this 7 years of plenty, he starts gathering some of the grain to store. Um, and it's during the 7 years that he then has two children with his wife, um, Manasseh and Ephraim. And to again sum up, and we read, I should say I, because I can only speak to myself, but I read these things and sort of gloss over them. Manasseh literally means, so Manasseh um, sounds like a word that means forget. And Joseph named his older son Manasseh because finally he says God has made him forget his troubles and everyone in his father's family. So 13 years after the fact, he's now at a point where God has, and it should speak to how he must have felt the entire time, right? He's now at a point where God has made me forget all the troubles. So that's 13 years of carrying this, 13 years of feeling abandoned, of feeling betrayed, of feeling, saddened. And finally, with his older son, he says he names his older son Manasseh, which means a word like forgetting in the language, and says God has made me forget all my troubles. And then when he has Ephraim, his second son, he says Ephraim means again sounds like a word fruitful, or comes from a word that whose root is fruitful. Um, no, it sounds like a Hebrew term that means fruitful, because God has made him fruitful in this land of my grief. I think we take that for granted, that that's 13 years living in the land of his grief. Um, Now, when the 7 years of plenty come to an end, we get the 7 years of famine. And once that famine spreads out throughout, it starts outside of Egypt, of course, because they've got all this plenty and that sort of spills over a little bit. But the famine eventually spreads out through the land of Egypt, and people start crying out to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says, "Go to Joseph." And Joseph starts to distribute what's been saved over that 7 years. And people come to buy grain from Joseph from all over the world because the famine was so severe throughout. Now, I've heard, and I haven't corroborated this myself, so take it with a pinch of salt, that historically there are accounts of these sort of massive famines that occurred, thousands of years before that. People tie into this famine that ravaged, the entire, not just Egypt, but the entire sort of ancient Near East, so Egypt and all the surrounding areas, Iran, Palestine, all of those places. And it becomes a stuff of myth, right? Because we don't have that many accounts. But effectively, Joseph would have saved at least around half the world with this action. You've got to imagine 7 years of piling up, extra grain and then selling them now. Um, so in 42, word reaches Canaan that there is grain in Egypt, and Jacob sends Joseph's older brothers down. Now, again, we see the dynamic. Jacob, we got to remember, Jacob worked 7 years for Rachel and got Leah, and then worked an extra 7 years for Rachel to then marry Rachel. 14 years for Rachel, that the Bible describes from Jacob's point of view was like a few days, speaking to how much he loved Rachel, that he didn't care for 14 years to work just for her to be his bride, right? And so he loved her dearly, and thus loved Joseph, who was her first child after she had been prevented from giving birth for so long. Um, and then her last born was Benjamin, who came and whose birth actually she died during. So Jacob obviously has such a deep love for Joseph and for Benjamin. And at this point, Jacob, for the past 20 years now, has believed Joseph to be dead and has only Benjamin. So when he sends the brothers out to go and you got to imagine Benjamin is at least 13 years now, right? Because Joseph has been gone 13 years and Benjamin was there before. So he's probably, I don't want to even guess, but at least 13 years. He's at least a teenager at the very least. And that's being super conservative. Um, but Jacob's not letting him go, right? Jacob is not letting him go because that's all he has left of Rachel and Joseph. And so the brothers go, they go and buy the grain. They don't recognize Joseph when he comes. Um, But Joseph starts to, speak harshly with them, calling them spies and trying to, I think, probably trying to get some information from them as to the state of affairs with his father because he doesn't have any contact with them. They literally thought he was dead. Um, and they offer up that they were actually 12. The youngest is back. So Joseph now knows, okay, my full brother Benjamin is alive and with father. And he, sorry, just checking that little one is still sleeping. He sort of goes about this in a weird way where he threatens, calls them spies, threatens them, and then says that he's going to keep one of them and they should go and bring his younger brother, and that will be proof that they are not spies. Now, you got to imagine people are coming from all over the world to come and buy grain, and he's focused in on these Hebrew guys. And of course, they're saying to themselves, we, God is punishing us. God is punishing us for what we did with our brother. And Reuben, I think at some point even says, I told you guys not to kill him, but you wouldn't listen. I told you not to sin against him, but you wouldn't listen. Um, and now they have to answer this vote. But and yeah, Pastor Lyle points out that he was also checking, are they still the ruthless brothers that sort of effectively considered killing him and ultimately sold him into slavery. Um, and they to some extent, I'd actually argue that they kind of are because he keeps Simeon back, right? And you got to wonder. I also wonder why he picked Simeon. Now, the only thing that comes to mind, and I'm sorry, I'm scooting through, but this is now in verse 24, because they actually said so when Reuben says, "Didn't I tell you um, not to sin against Joseph?" But they wouldn't listen to him. They were speaking in Hebrew, and they didn't know that Joseph understood them because Joseph, as part of his role and what was going on with people coming from all over the world, he was using an interpreter to speak to them. So they didn't know that Joseph understood them, but he's clearly seen that at the very least they feel some sort of guilt. They feel some sort of that they're experiencing some sort of punishment for their actions. And that's cool. And indeed, when they say this, when Reuben says, "You wouldn't listen, and now we have to answer for his blood," Joseph turned away and began to weep. He wept in silence, because he got emotional hearing them sort of effectively confess their wrong and show some sort of remorse for it, at least whilst they thought they were being punished. And then Joseph goes on to choose Simeon. And the thing that struck me about Simeon was, I just want to confirm. Uh, I think he was Leah's, okay, second son. Cool. So Leah's second son, Simeon. Well, I think it was Simeon and Levi, I believe. Uh, let's just check. Who killed Shechem for Dinah's assault? So I'm just asking AI all of these things because it's just quicker. Um, but I've given AI the context. So I'm using ChatGPT and Claude, and I've given them the context of a Bible study, so they know that I'm referring to. I'm wanting answers from the Bible, references from the Bible. Yes. So, um, hey, shout out to the Avises who joined as well. So in Genesis 34, um, it's noted as this: Simeon and Levi deceived Shechem and went to kill. Simeon and Levi attacked. Now Simeon was the second brother. He was the second son of Jacob. Uh, I want to check which was he. Was he the older of Leah's Um, um, okay, so I've just asked for a um, order of the sons, oldest to youngest, of the 12 tribes of Israel. And Simeon is Leah's second son, Levi being her third, Judah being her fourth. But Simeon and Levi, so Simeon leading the charge. Reuben has already demonstrated that he's somewhat of a more level-headed person, being the oldest. He was the one to say not to kill um, Joseph. But Simeon and Levi sounding make the way that they record it, it makes it sound like Simeon is the one leading the charge. They're the ones that go and slaughter all the men um, of what's it called? Um, all the men of the city when Shechem violates Dinah. So Simeon is probably the toughest. He's probably the hardest, which is that's what came to mind as to why he chose Simeon. Reuben being kind, Simeon probably was he was the ringleader when they went to slaughter these people. So he probably picks the toughest one or the hardest one because he does throw him in jail. Joseph throws Simeon in prison, albeit, again, we see that the prison, the state of prison here isn't like the prison we think of, but still, it's not the nicest of places. And he puts Simeon in prison whilst he sends the rest of the brothers back and tells them that they should come back with their younger sibling if to prove that they are indeed not spies. And that's where today's reading ends. But admittedly, I was a bit I wanted to figure out a little bit more, so I kept on reading. And in 43, it isn't until the grain that they had brought from Egypt was almost gone that they didn't go back. Now, I don't know how long that took, but these are 12, at least 9 bags. Imagine they didn't take back Simeon's bag, but I think they did. Um, 9 bags of grain that these guys have come to buy for their family. Now, probably was a lot of people, but I don't imagine it went away in just a week or two. It's a land of famine. They're probably rationing. They're probably trying to be as smart as it was. They probably bought a lot of grain. Um, and so I imagine it's a little bit of time. It doesn't explicitly say how long, but Simeon's in prison until they nearly finish the grain that they buy before they start to think about going back to get him and eventually send in Benjamin. But again, we'll get more into that tomorrow because tomorrow's reading is 43 to 45. Um, but alas, that's where we are. And Joseph's dream is finally coming true. And if I'm gonna say take anything away, I want to point out it took 20 years for God to realize the dream that He had given to Jacob, and thus whatever. Yeah, as Laya pointed out, their hope was not to go back in a hurry, so they left Simeon in that prison for probably a good while, probably a good while. But anyway, if I'm to leave us with anything today, I want to say, and we've got to be careful of not reading ourselves into the text. That's called narcigenesis, where we read the Bible and we immediately read ourselves into it without sort of understanding what it means historically. We take one thing and we immediately apply it to ourselves. We've got to be careful of that. But we can learn. We can learn from what we see. When Paul talks of a cloud of witnesses, it's a group of people whose stories we can look at and learn. And so, from this, one thing I would say is let's learn from Joseph and his patience to be patient if we also have dreams and desires. Um, it took 20 years for God to realize the dream that He had given to Joseph, and it's only now coming into fruition. but we can see God's hand moving it to be so. And actually, not just his family bowing down to him, but effectively the entire world. Um, and his patience and his dedication and his trust in God is what's kept him thus far. And so, if we have a dream and we have something God has put on our hearts, to be patient and know that God's timing is probably best. Um, but anyway, thank you for joining me. Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Emises. Um, and whoever watches this, whenever you do, I hope that encourages you to pick up the Bible, spend some time with God, spend some time in the Word. We're seeing God's interaction with people, especially in the past 43 chapters of Genesis in the book of Job. We're seeing how God deals with people, and that God hasn't changed. God remains the same. Um, and we can learn from his dealings and see who he is. And thus far, he's proven himself to be a capable and intentional and a good God. And that's the God that we serve, and the God that I hope you also find when you study, when you spend some time in the Word. So, hope you have a good night, a good rest of your day whenever you're watching this. And I will, God willing, see you tomorrow. All right. Peace out.